we sent a copy to Seth Godin, and Seth wrote a blog post the week after it came out. He said, drop everything you're doing. Don't judge a book by its cover. And that's when we first hit the New York Times bestseller lists. And the first initial observation we had was that people online tended to behave more like an introverted of themselves. I spend a lot of time, looking at what young kids are doing, what apps they're using, what's exciting to them, how they're experiencing certain things, because I want to know where the world is going, not where it is today, right? Because
hello and welcome to SEO Pioneers. Today I'm talking to New York Times bestselling author Bryan Eisenberg, who was the co-author of the legendary book Call to Action, which inspired me heavily in my online work in the mid-2000s. So I'm really excited to be speaking to Bryan today to get his backstory and running up to obviously writing the book, etc. So Bryan, hi, it's really nice to meet you.
It's a pleasure to be here, Shelley. It's exciting to be able to share some of those early days, because, as they say, those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. So it's worth getting it out there.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to go right back to the very, very early days, Bryan, and I believe you started out hacking bulletin boards just like Brett Tabke when you were a kid. Did you have a lot of experience with computers when you were younger?
Yeah, I started playing around with computers by the time I was like 12 years old. I had my bulletin board by 13. I was fortunate that my brother Jeffrey at that point had already moved out of the house, so I had his room that I moved into that had its own phone line, and so I was able to run the bulletin board system. So
oh wow,
it really all comes back to Jeffrey at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's a shame Jeffrey isn't here today, actually. So when you were experimenting with the bulletin boards, do you think that really fed into your later work? Do you think that laid the foundations for it?
I've always been a tinkerer, right? I've always tried, I hate to use the word, but manipulating or persuading people on where I wanted them to go on the bulletin board, right? So I'd hacked the menu system, but even back then, to try to get them to go to areas that weren't being used as much. So I guess, it's always had some kind of influence. I've always had a fascination with why people do the things they do. It's the reason I was becoming a social worker before I became an entrepreneur and got involved online. So yeah, I think it always had some kind of play in it. And, I've always had a passion for computers and programming. And
it's quite interesting, actually, because having that passion, but then you went to college to do social work, which is there's quite obviously a difference there. What prompted that?
I was my friend group's, psychologist, so to speak. I was that anchor that everybody relied on. Jeffrey was the business guy. Jeffrey was the guy who, by the time like I said, he was 17 years old, he moved out and was living in New York City at that point. He had his own apartment in Midtown. He was working as an investment banker, so he was traveling around the world. He was making a lot of money, and I really wanted to focus in on making a difference, right? And so so I was studying to be a social worker. Before that, it was when I was really young, I thought I would be an actor. So never a writer. I can tell you that much. That's the one that's the big surprise in my life.
Gosh, so there's quite a few tangents there. Actor, writer, social worker, computer geek. Okay, we're looking at all the spectrums. But then why did you move away from social work then?
So I was going for my master's of social work at the Wurzweiler School of Social Work. And my brother had just left the investment banking world. He had gone to some self-development seminar. And what he took out of it more than anything was that he wanted to have a relationship with his brother. We had no relationship beforehand. Like, the nicest thing he had to say with me was bleep head. Like, I won't even use the words, right? There was just nothing nice he would say about me, because I was 4.5 years younger, and I can understand the difference, right? I've got 3 kids similar in age groups. At least they get a little better than he and I did. but his number one goal was to have a relationship. And so he asked me if I come join him in doing a business. And that's when we started dabbling a little bit in sales consulting, and the internet started first showing up, and we started playing around in that arena.
At what point did you start to recognize potentially that the internet was going to be an opportunity? I mean, did you grasp in those early days how big it was going to be, or did you think it might just be something perhaps more of a novelty?
No. I mean, we knew it right away. You know, having been in bulletin boards for so many years, and having that kind of background that, you know, people are going to want to be online, people are going to want to communicate. You know, it's just a question of who's going to be doing it early. You know, I remember going from, you know, dial up to a DSL line really early, as soon as, you know, it was offered in our area. We just knew it. Like, there was just no question to us that this was where the future was going. Everybody was going to have a site on the World Wide Web.
So what was your very first business? Was it management training? Is that right?
We were doing sales consulting. We did some work with Puma back early in the day. And then we also built a couple of our own sites. So I built an online candy shop very early on. We had built a site for our nutritional supplement business back at those days as well. That was one of the early ones. And I think that's really what started us getting on the path to doing a lot of the tinkering we were doing. Because, of course, you know, we were playing with SEO with things like web position gold back in the early days, and trying to absorb as much information as we could. You know, about how to get people to find the website, because that was the first things. But I guess that's also what drew me to the initial web trackers, right? Is finding things to measure. Hey, are we making an impact? Are we doing something that's doing something differently?
Just as an aside, I just wanted to interject something. I believe that you knew Adam Audette and nearly ended up working for him. Is that right? What's the backstory to that?
So in that nutritional business, we ended up having to declare bankruptcy because our partner one day decided to basically, he was borrowing money from our friends and family for inventory because we were getting more demand than we can keep up with. And then one day we show up to the office in New Jersey, and he had changed all the locks. And that basically caused us to essentially go bankrupt. Because we also wanted to make sure all our friends and family got repaid, and so we needed to recapitalize. And so, you know, Jeffrey was the first to take a job somewhere, and then I was looking around, and I knew we wanted to do something with the internet, and I had seen Adam's request for something, and so made an appointment. I scheduled to meet him in New York City, and then he never showed.
Oh, interesting.
Yep.
Have you ever spoken to Adam about that since?
I think we mentioned it once, like in an email, going back and forth. But yeah, you know, I wonder, with as much impact of the early people that he hired have had on the industry, you know, how much more impact would it have had if I ended up there, or less impact? Like, who knows?
I mean, that's quite fascinating, because you think, what kind of trajectory might your life have taken? That's like a real sliding doors moment, isn't it? But you could have just ended up in the same place.
You know, I got fortunate. We moved into, you know, persuasion and obviously, you know, conversion optimization. But that may have never have happened if, you know, we just stayed in an SEO agency.
So
I don't know.
When did you set it? Was it Future Now? That's right.
Mm-hmm.
It was the first agency. Was that 98 you set out?
1998. Yep.
Yeah. And so how long were you really focusing on SEO before you started to progress with the conversion, or was the conversion work immediate?
It was kind of a little bit of both early on. So this was 95 to 98. We were tinkering around. For a little while, I was working for IDT, their net-to-phone division. And I was helping sell a little button that would go on your website that allowed them to do click to call right to the store, you know, over voice over IP. And I made friends with a bunch of the early websites back then as I was selling them. And I would just offer some of the suggestions of things I saw that would help them also improve their sales. And it started improving their sales. And at some point we decided that, obviously, we can do some of this SEO and this sales stuff, which we originally called digital salespeople, on our own. And by 1998, we decided to, start the agency.
So were you actually focusing a lot more on doing sales rather than doing the technical side?
Correct. I realized early on that, anybody could do, SEO. There's going to be a lot of those people out there, right? Because there's already starting to be quite a bit of a group, from the, ISEO lists and stuff like that. But there were very few people really engaged on the, on the conversion side or on the sales side of this, right? Everybody was thinking about, traffic. But I had come from a sales background, right? I had come from, selling nutritional products and marketing those as well, right? So for me, it was really this kind of intersection of, how do you get the attention of traffic, but also get sales? Because without it, you need cash flow. Like that's how businesses run. So to me, just having, just having a plain website without the purpose of sales just didn't make sense in the long term.
So it seems like you're actually bringing together a lot of kind of classic offline marketing approaches here. And so did you just see conversion as like an extension, not necessarily of SEO, but more of a development of offline classic marketing?
Well, as you know, the early days of SEO was really about, directories and getting other humans to put your site on the directories and stuff like that. And it had and fooling the basic algorithms, right, to rank you for terms. But I realized that, hey, even if they came for those pages, it wasn't necessarily going to make them buy, and buy, stuff from the website if the content didn't make any sense. And so we started focusing in on some of the early copywriting. And so going back to those early ISO lists, right, you had guys like Nick Osborne and Dan Janal from IPR at some point. And there was just a handful of us who were really talking about the sales side of it, the copy side of it. But to me at that point, I realized, okay, there's a lot more, obviously, because it's not just the words, it's also the technology, it's also understanding how search traffic behaves. And so for me, it was just lots of years of discovery and experimentation and truly trying to understand human behavior online as opposed to how it was different offline. And so I would say the first initial observation we had was that people online tended to behave more like an introverted of themselves versus more of an extroversion of themselves. And so that alone helped us start guiding the way we'd approach persuasion, right? Because you're making your own decisions. So we needed to give people the ability to research on their own and discover things. And that's how we got into a lot of internal linking and a lot of content, and that changed a big part of our approach.
So when you came to like the conclusion with the introversion approach to how users were behaving, is this through extensive testing or just observing with your own client sites?
It was our client sites. We were doing little labs. We'd bring people in and we'd watch the way they behaved, right? We put them in front of websites and we wanted to understand that behavior. We started doing studies of like what we would call the most customer-centric websites. And we just truly wanted to understand, how people were interacting with this new medium, because, obviously, you started having some of the early usability folks like, Jakob Nielsen and stuff like that, but they were looking at it from a software approach. And we're like, no. If you're trying to do sales or marketing, you can't look at this as software, right? Because software, if you have to use Word at work, right, or Excel, you're required to do it. But someone coming to a website, they're not required to be at that website. They're doing so because they have some intent to want to be there. So that, it's their own personal reasons. So we knew the software analogy didn't totally work here, right? There were elements that would make sense, but that wasn't the whole story. And then you had guys, or early guys like Jared Spool as well, right? One of the early usability guys in the space, also looking at this, and we just realized, no, there's this mix of understanding, user design and what do you call it? Information architecture, coding, the speed of sites loading. There's so many factors, that eventually obviously made it into our books that we talk about some of those factors. But I think that was the critical part to us, is that we were seeing the world very different. We were never focused in on just the search engine, because we realized the search engine is not the one with the credit card.
Yeah, this is really fascinating, because obviously most of the early SEOs were purely focusing on breaking the algorithm. They were very, very much, well, I mean, it was before Google. It was like, say, Alta Vista, etc. And then it was, very much Google centric, and it was all about that, how you could manipulate just to get the rankings. But nobody was really thinking beyond that, what was on the page. Who else? Because I think probably what a lot of people don't realize, who are a lot younger, is that, this was a really radically different approach. So when the internet happened, it was so radically different from anything else we'd been operating, where previously it'd been going into a shop or using a phone directory, an actual paper phone directory. So it was all a completely new way of learning. I mean, I guess you really were one of the absolute pioneers. I mean, apart from, as you said, Jared Spool and Jacob Nielsen that you were feeding off, was there anybody else that you were looking to that fed your work? Or was it just pure feeling your way and experimentation?
No, there were definitely other people who, were exploring things and writing things. Keith Instone was one of those guys who had an early directory of usability articles that he put together, and he'd discover interesting things. And I'd spend time learning from that. I think that, the key difference for me was the early days of the internet was really truly about discovery, right? I mean, if you go back long enough, when you got online, you hope to find a page with a whole bunch of new links that you could start exploring, because it was the only way to find anything. There was no search, right? Eventually, search started coming out, and you started being able to dig into little interesting niches that again, you hope to discover something. And just if you were discovered, you had an opportunity to make a sale, because no one knew that, this kind of business even existed, or that they could get this outside of maybe, the big city from their town. So it was a different world. There wasn't a lot of content. So, as soon as you started putting content on there and you started being discovered, you were making business online, essentially. It was the Wild West. We've now come into a world where we're in an overabundance of content, right?
Yeah.
And so now it's a question of, okay, how do you really distinguish yourself? And even, I've had these conversations with the folks at Google and, the folks like Ping Jen who are at Microsoft. And it's, how do you deliver a quality experience that replicates what humans are actually looking for in the experience? And we know, obviously, Google's algorithm now is focused in on that experience, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's critical to understand, why it got there, how it got there, and also where it's going. It's why I've predicted that, obviously, where AI was taking it, big data was taking it, was a whole different direction. There's a quote, and I meant to pull this up beforehand, but it's a quote by Eric Schmidt. And he talked about, how Google's goal is to replicate what's happening in the real world. So think about that. Mm-hmm. Online has always been its own little microcosm for so many years, okay? Just 20 plus years that it's just been its own world. But if Google really wanted to understand what's happening in the real world, it couldn't just rely on online signals. And probably about, 10, 12 years ago, I started noticing things were ranking that didn't have online signals. I'll give you a perfect example of this. We were working with a guy who sold educational toys, okay? And great directory. He really did great content, helping you figure out like what were the right toys for the right age group and based on their person. Like, he did great stuff, but he could never break the top 3. And he always wondered why, because like Fisher Price barely even had a website. Like, it couldn't be crawled. It was impossible to crawl at the time. But Fisher Price was always number one. Now, if you have kids, you realize Fisher Price deserves to be there. So how is it ranking number one when this other site that's so much better optimized for search couldn't rank for number one? And that's when we realized, yeah, Google is using third-party data sources, and Frederick Valais validated that. A bunch of other people have validated that. The credit bureaus, the stuff like that, they all have what people are purchasing, different things in different categories. So if I had to know, like, who are the top educational toy vendors, I could just pull it up from the credit card data, couldn't I?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And is that a valid signal to produce real results for a search engine? Absolutely, because it's truly relevant to the user. And I think what we're going to discover as people in the search industry is that these third-party signals are going to have more and more weight, especially when we can't use the personalization factors, because a lot of the tracking and cookies are going away.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Sorry,
You didn't know we were going to go to the future of search today.
No, it's just great listening to you. My mind is just going off on so many levels there. Just going back to the beginning, like with the work that you were doing, because obviously, it's still very much current today, but back then it was, as we've said, very new. How did you know you were on the right track? Was it just a feeling, an intuition, or were you getting like indications, signals?
No, it was a lot of intuition, but I came across people like my friend Jim Novo, okay, who co-authored the Marketer's Common Sense Guide to E-Metrics with me. That for those who are early in this, you might remember that Web Trends used to give this away at their roadshow. This is an important document. This is where we started outlining some of the key metrics that websites needed to look at, because we only had log analyzers back then, and they'd give you these. I remember doing analysis by spreadsheet. It was terrible. But the metrics, such as like a bounce rate, right, which Web Trends made us change the name to reject rate in the book. Another long story. But Jim Novo had a great background and a unique background, right? So Jim Novo was the former head of Interactive for the Home Shopping Network, right before he came online. And as Jim famously used to say, we used to have conversations daily, and he used to say, I've seen this movie before. And he saw all the same things happening in a television network, right? They would change products based on how the early calls were going. They were getting questions, they'd feed it back to the staff so they can get more sales. Like, it was just brilliant. And they had metrics like people called in and hung up right away, right? That was the bounce rate. And so having those conversations with him, we were able to take those metrics and then start using things like, Web Trends, and then eventually, Urchin and a bunch of others, eventually became Google Analytics, to start proving the things that we were doing.
Did you? I mean, I've always believed that everything goes back to direct marketing. And, I've studied quite a lot of Victor Schwab and Claude C. Hopkins. Did you look to any of these guys?
Oh, of course. I mean, my first book was Persuasive Online Copywriting, and it came because I was a student of understanding the power of words, right? Word clipping and stuff like that, right? Like Rossa Reeves really need to understand the early days of advertising, and how important Ogilvy as well, right? How important the power of words were. And this is one of the things that bothered me very early on about the internet, and it still sort of shocked me. In the early days of the internet, I think it was 1998, 99, shop.org published the first average conversion rate for the web at 1.9%. And I said, why are we seeing the same numbers as we're seeing in direct response, right? A good conversion rate on a direct response letter was around 2%. I'm like, there we are pushing stuff on people who are not expecting it, and they're still able to sell 2%. But here, people are coming to websites because they want to be there, and we're still only getting 2% conversion. we've got a lot of issues. And it's sad that today it still hasn't creeped up that much when you think about it. But I think there's so much more opportunity to understand the power of words and just the old-fashioned direct marketing, but blending it with modern day branding techniques, right? And the use of technology that we have. Because when you start understanding where all of that's going, you realize that there's only two ways to increase sales in the world. Okay, you either have to reduce friction, and the problem with the early days of the internet is there was a lot of friction. One of my very first articles talked about how we used to go into shopping carts early in the day. I don't know if you remember this, and you'd hit add to cart, and they take you to the checkout, and there was no way to return to the shopping cart or to the website.
Yeah.
You were just done. And I said, that's like going to the supermarket, pulling something off the shelf, putting it in your shopping cart, and just staring at it. It just didn't make any sense just from a human psychology point of view. Said we need to add a continue shopping button. They didn't exist before we talked about it, right? And then, of course, understanding this other side of creating great relationships through branding. And the internet is so amazing at doing that, because now we have so many more powerful ways to motivate people, right? So friction on one side, reduce that, increase motivation, and you should see your sales conversion rate go up.
But so when obviously going back to you'd established Future Now, at what point did you start to develop Persuasion Architecture? And to actually coin that, I mean, I know you were working on conversion very early on, but when did you actually start to really define?
It's a great question. Well, when we put out Call to Action, and it became a New York Times bestseller, thanks to Web Trends for some of their bulk purchases that they were going to give away at their roadshow, which also caused us to have to edit and finish the book 3 weeks earlier than we expected. So we had no idea of what we were going to do for a cover. So we went ahead and we created something based off of a kind of our mentor's book, The Wizard of Ads. And we created, this cover. Hold on, I want to pull it up for you. With this Egyptian eagle on there, okay? And we did two things. We sold 3 copies for the price of 1, okay? If you bought it directly from us. And then we sent copies to influencers, right? And we included a bunch of influencers inside the book, but we sent a copy to Seth Godin. And Seth wrote a blog post the week after it came out. He said, drop everything you're doing. Don't judge a book by its cover. He said, I wish I would have read this book before I had released his ebook on conversion. But he didn't. But he said, everybody should go buy the copy. And it became a New York Times bestseller. At that point, we realized the limitations of what conversion rate optimization could actually do, right? I could only put so much lipstick on the pig. I could only take and fix all your assumptions from, that you built your website on, and it was just a cap. I said, so we knew we had to come up with a planning strategy that would change the experience. So by that point, we had already been experimenting for a few years with the concept of personas and writing to personas, but we needed to find new ways to plan these experiences. And so we looked at also based on all the redesigns we were doing with clients, how the design process was working and where the failures were. And that's what we outlined over the next year in our book, Waiting for Your Cat to Bark, right? And that's when we really focused in on just having Persuasion Architecture be our cornerstone.
So
2005, 2006.
Call to Action came out in 2005, is that right?
Correct.
Yeah, just tracking back a little bit, because I know Call to Action was the first New York Times bestseller and was a huge explosion for you. But I believe you'd been writing a few books before that. Is that right?
Correct. We had written the Marketer's Common Sense Guide to E-Metrics. So that was an ebook. By the way, I still think that may have been our most profitable book in all time. which is crazy to think about it, okay? Considering how many copies of like Waiting for You Cat to Bark and stuff we published. But we wrote Persuasive Online Copywriting.
Oh, was that the first one?
That was the first physical book that we printed.
That's the first physical one.
And there aren't many of these left, but there were two reasons this book came out. Number one, our mentor, Roy Williams, who in the late 90s had written a trilogy of best-selling books, the Wizard of Ads trilogy, who now runs the Wizard Academy in Chapel Dulcinea here in Austin, Texas. So it's part of the reason we're down here. And then we were at a party. This is going to be a name that a lot of people don't remember as well. Larry Chase.
Oh, I remember that name.
Who wrote one of the first internet marketing newsletters. It was him and Ralph Wilson who wrote the first two internet marketing newsletters. And Larry was a great friend. And he was holding a party in his house back then. This is before he got married. He had an apartment that was right by the Brooklyn Bridge. So you like go onto his balcony and there's the bridge. Nice. It was incredible. So we spent the whole night there and, you know, had a great time. And as we're getting ready to leave, he says, hold on. And he goes to his bedroom, he comes back out and he hands us a copy of his book. And it's, you know, it's about that thick. And he tells us, let me give you a copy of my $35 business card. And it was that, then we knew that we absolutely needed to have our own business card. And we worked backwards. So we said, okay, you know, we knew this is something we could write very quickly because we knew a lot about copywriting, and this chapter's here about SEO and stuff like that as well. And we have some case studies in here. And we knew we could figure out what the cost was that we wanted to stay under when we self-published this thing, so we could give it out as a business card. And we've always thought about it that way from very, very, very early on. And so that book became a cult kind of classic. I mean, there were copies sold on Amazon and eBay for over $1,000. We never understood it, but there are people who come to us years later showing us all the highlights they had in the book and stuff like it's crazy. It's been out of print for I can't even tell you how many years. But that copywriting book lasted for years. It got us early on invited on stages between that and the e-marketer's guide. That basically launched our career until obviously we exploded with call to action. That was the one that really put us on the map. You know, we knew that there was this technology out there that mattered. The only way people were going to understand they needed conversion rate optimization help was if they understood they had a conversion problem and were measuring it. And so the original version that we wrote wasn't tool agnostic at all. Okay. It just used, you know, every tool out there, and here's kind of the things that you can look for to kind of understand what's going on your website. And like I said, he had experience from his home shopping network days, and we had experience from working with our own clients. And we were like, okay, well, you know, what can we do? And so we want to educate people on that. And that's when Web Trends found the ebook, and they said, hey, you know, can we distribute that? And then we said, sure. And so we charged them for that. So they were giving out physical copies of it and paying us for each copy. And then eventually they decided to license the whole thing and basically had us, you know, kind of just rewrite it a little bit from their end. And that was, they had given out thousands of copies of this thing.
What year did you write eMarketer's Guide?
That was the copyright on it, I think, is 2002. But I think we wrote in 2001 as well. Yeah. So the original, I think that, yeah, 2002 is the copyright. I think the original PDF and Excel spreadsheet that came with it was like 2001.
So were you just selling that? Were you just pushing that out on your website originally before web?
Correct. Yeah, so people could download the free calculators. We had a couple of other calculators on our website, kind of also as well, one of the first calculators, you know, I built was a conversion rate calculator, right? Where you can put in your traffic, you can put in your number of sales, and we give you a conversion rate. And that's how we started ranking for conversion rate back in the day, because calculator. We had built a calculator. As I've told this story previously, the reason we came up with conversion rate to begin with was because it was the only thing that had sort of like a sales kind of tone, but also had traffic volume because people were looking for currency conversion. And back then, xe.com was the only other thing that ranked, and so we only had to compete with that. And at some point, we overtook it.
So when you wrote the book, you were basically just experimenting with ways of self-promotion.
Self-promotion and education, right? I think that you can't have one without the other. If you're just self-promoting, you're just too big of an ego, right? But it really was about trying to educate the market that there's so much more. Like here's how you write for the web. Here's how you have to write, for readability, and here's how you have to write for search, and like these are the things that people needed to know. And this is about the same time that Nick Osborne had put out his book, Net Words, if you remember it back in the day. But there's a reason, by the way, why we gave that book the title Persuasive Online Copywriting, and it all has to do with Nick, right? Amazon back in those early days was a very raw search engine. It really just took terms from the title, okay? And so we put online copywriting in the title because we were hoping people would look for online copywriting books and they'd find our book. That's why that title is unlike any other book we've ever written.
So as the book started to take off, at what point did you realize that actually this is going to be a far more lucrative future? Or was it just more of did you start to see yourself as more of a writer and a speaker? How did that side develop?
No, the speaker part started, back in the early SES days. Danny Sullivan had, seen our contribution for years, and of course, we also started writing for Clixy at that point, and this was before Ann and Andy had sold it, and we realized that we were starting to get an audience, right, where people were really starting to pay attention to this thing. And then when we decided to write Call to Action, we knew we'd have some decent sales because we already had a bunch of pre-orders. We knew, Web Trends was buying a bunch of books in bulk to give away at their road tour. And of course, we had a 40,000 person email list. So we were promoting it. So we knew we'd have some sales. But when Seth blogged about it, and he had just released his own little ebook on conversion, we knew that the world was starting to pay attention to this topic. And that's when we first hit the New York Times bestseller lists. And it was different. And that's when we got approached by, several publishers to write our next book, which became Waiting for Your Cat to Bark, which became our biggest seller.
Do you think, at this point when things started to really take off, did you feel more fulfillment from the success of hitting a New York Times bestseller, or did you feel more fulfillment than actually developing the theory of persuasion architecture?
So when we hit the New York Times bestseller, it was kind of a very difficult time in our lives. We had lost an uncle. We had lost our grandmother. My dad passed kind of in between all that. Wife had a miscarriage. Things were really crazy. We actually almost never really celebrated the success of the bestseller. Like, we acknowledged that we did it, and our staff printed up a nice poster with it and the charts and all that. No idea where that eventually ended up. But we knew that we were trying to make this difference on just educating people on how to persuade people online. And so that was our number one mission. We were just focused in on that. The real focus in on speaking came sort of after we left the agency, and there were some difficult times just trying to adjust to what we were going to do afterwards. Jeffrey wasn't doing very well physically at that time. Again, just kind of all the aggravation that we had to deal with taking the agency public, and that's a whole other story. But that's when I said, okay, I'm just going to focus in on speaking. And I already had 1 or 2 gigs kind of set up. And that's when I said, okay, we're going to spend a lot more time focused in on that. And so we were doing that until we were brought in to do some work for Google. And that changed Persuasion Architecture to what we now use, which we call buyer legends. And it was because Google asked us to develop something that was as good as Persuasion Architecture, but more agile. Because as our friend Seja Pang used to like to say, is that, working at Google is like living on quicksand. The earth's going to change underneath you at any moment. And so we had to develop a much more agile process, which is what the buyer legends process became.
When were you working with Google?
This was 2014, 2015, probably.
Okay, right. That was moving forward quite a bit. So just going back to the agency Future Now, when did you start to exit from that?
That was what, 2010, 12, something along those lines.
Okay.
Yeah.
Was that quite a challenging buyout then?
It was a lot of conflict. It was our baby for a long time. It's where we create our newsletter, Grok.com, and we no longer had access to that, and we had to start figuring out, okay, what's going to be next. Luckily, we had enough of a platform from the best-selling books and enough people who knew us, because we didn't have a big agency anymore. Agencies need to feed their employees jobs. Since it was just Jeffrey and I at that point, and a couple of friends who we'd bring in as we needed, we didn't need to take in as many jobs. So we just focused on ones that we found interesting, like working for Google.
So your brother Jeffrey, it was interesting you said right at the beginning that you didn't have much of a relationship when you were growing up, but you seem to be very close, and you work incredibly closely together. Do you think you would have accomplished as much as you have as individuals, or do you think the two of you working? Yeah,
not a chance. We thought a lot of alike. In our history in business, we've had one disagreement that came during that crazy time I was just telling you about, when everybody passed away. It was just a lot of emotion kind of stuff going on. But essentially, we've had the same goals, the same missions. We just knew we had different skills, and we worked on those together. Jeffrey's more of the business guy, finance guy. He did a better job at selling me than I could sell myself. And I was more of the creative, more technical person, and really took all the time to learn and understand everything, and come up with these ideas and test them out and make sure they worked in the real world.
Would you say you're obviously you're brothers. I know what it's like to have siblings. Are you naturally competitive, or do you think you're more cooperative?
I think probably when we were younger, we were a lot more competitive. We both very competitive natures on our own, but I think we've become a lot more cooperative. And it's funny because I was on a podcast recently, and someone asked me, I always seem to be, promoting other people and talking about other people. And they said, for someone who says they're competitive, how is this that you're always, focused on other people? And I said, I think as I've grown older, started getting some more gray hairs, I realized that it's co-opetition that matters, right? I'm looking to build my team of people, the people I trust. And we did the same thing through all the years of our agency. There are a lot of people that we helped create and generate careers from. And we were thrilled to do that as we were growing.
So right in the very early days, you were pretty much operating on the edge of SEO, focusing more on conversion. So how much were you interacting with the SEO community? Were you involved with them?
Oh yeah, heavily. Our first employee was an SEO-based employee. They were physically doing the SEO. He still does SEO and affiliate stuff to this day. We were still doing some early jobs. We were in an incubator in New York City, and kind of working around with a bunch of different companies. They had a diamond company, they had a magazine company, they became one of our early clients. They had a what do you call it, a dishware company that we were working with. And it was the owner of the incubator who one day came to us. It's also how I got the nickname the Grok. That's a whole different thing. That was his. His
Bryan, sorry, you have to tell us, how did you get the nickname the Grok?
So his assistant would always say that I Grok.com. And if you know Heinlein, right, from Stranger in a Strange Land, he used to talk about how, like, to grok means to understand at a deep cellular level, right, to like just absorb everything. And so Susan, I think, was her name. It's been and Henry, a lot of years I haven't thought of those names, but she came up with that nickname. And then some of my clients started calling me the Grok after that, and it just stuck. And then we eventually created a newsletter called Grok.com, where we published all our early content. And it was in that incubator that Henry told us that, you guys should really focus in on what you do uniquely, right? Which was conversion rate. And he was right.
Yeah.
He was just right way too early, right? Because if we would have kept up with the SEO side and the conversion side, we would have grown faster as an agency than struggling to just focus in on conversion.
So do you think I mean, I know you couldn't really have existed without the SEO industry, but it's like, how integral was it, the development and success of your work? Were you actually interacting with any other industries to help with the development, like, for example, usability or accessibility?
No, there was a little bit of usability. People, we spoke at a couple of usability conferences and stuff like that. But I would say the majority was the SEO people, because that audience and their clients understood that you needed to kind of optimize what you had.
Yeah.
Right. And so it was just a very natural kind of progression from, hey, you can optimize for traffic, but once the traffic gets it, what are you doing with it?
Yeah.
Right. And so we would share clients a lot with that community and back and forth. So they were critical to this, right? And all the early conferences, there was no place to talk about SEO, but Danny Sullivan opened up that first spot to talk about analytics for the first time, and then eventually got into conversion over the years. But yeah, from 1998 to 2001, that was a long time of waiting for someone to actually care about conversion.
When did you start speaking at conferences?
2001 was the first one.
Which one was it?
I think Dallas was the first one, and then Boston after that one.
SES?
Yes.
Okay. And what kind of reactions were you getting from the community when you started to speak about this?
I think it was eye-opening for people. I used to be crowded with people. The only other people who sort of talked about anything similarly related, and I think it was their first conference as well, was Jill Whalen and Heather. We were talking about copywriting, right?
Yeah.
And so we were kind of stuck on the side there, the only ones kind of talking about this persuasion side of the business, when everyone else was talking technical SEO.
Did you get good crowds coming to speak to hear you?
They were reasonable. They, back in the day, look, I think back then everybody was just hungry to learn about everything about, online. There just was so little information. And so, yeah, the rooms were pretty filled. We'd have people come up to us afterwards. It helped build our agency. That's where we got almost all our leads early on. Some of it was online, but those people would come to those conferences and we'd finally meet in person. And that's, where we'd sign business. But yeah, those early days, you spoke at a conference, you were getting, 5 to 10 clients every single time.
Yeah, I'm just quite fascinated as to how, as I said earlier, SEOs are very, very much focused on, it was very technical back then. It was technical and it was link building, wasn't it? It was, how to rank, how to cloak, how to rank.
Yep.
Anything you could do to get that position, not so much consideration as to what was going on the page. That was very much secondary and later. So I'm just really fascinated to understand as to like the reaction and how SEOs were responding to it in those early days.
There were those who saw and it made sense to them, but obviously they were focusing on their stuff, so they weren't really worried about it. They were like, okay, that's a whole different side. The other thing to keep in mind is in those early days, remember, a lot of it was about all these doorway pages, right?
Yeah.
And we were creating all of these separate pages apart from the website. So they really weren't worried about what the actual website was per se doing.
How long did it take until it really started to get traction? Would you say it's when Call to Action was published, 2005? Is that when you felt there was traction for what you were promoting?
We started to feel traction probably around 2004-ish. Yeah, and that's what made us decide to put out Call to Action. Exactly. Right, we were already starting to speak at some of the e-commerce conferences back then as well, the shop.orgs and stuff like that. Actually, even before that was, we also spoke at one of the Direct Marketing Association had a digital arm back in the early days, and so those guys also brought us in early, and that's when we met people like Mark Walken, who built one of the first testing tools in their conferences. So yeah, there was a bunch of different, verticals that we were pulling from, and we were getting people to understand kind of what we were doing. But yeah, we were just kind of weaving together all of these different disciplines, and that's one of the things we've always said. It's like, if you want to be a good CRO, we published at one time on ClickSeal like a list of books, and it was like 30 different books from so many diverse categories, because it's not just one skill.
How critical do you think the timing was for what you did and achieved? Do you think you can replicate the same today? Trying to create and build, like write books, or
well,
I know things have
kind of
changed.
like I told you earlier. Back then it was a lot easier because there wasn't a lot of information. So any information was like magical. Like people were just devouring it. And so there was a shortage of content. Today there's an overabundance of content, and people have so many different ways to engage. And if you look, how much of time is being spent on 15-second TikTok videos today? Like how much thought leadership can you get across on that and get through all the noise? It is a lot harder today than it was back then. Would it have been possible? Yes, because we were doing all the right things, right? We were pioneering a new category that made sense, because in every other business in the world, you had a VP of marketing, but you also had a VP of sales. And in the online world, you had the VP of marketing, but there was no one responsible for sales online. So we knew that eventually had to kind of make sense, right? It's just sometimes you have to rely on common sense.
What do you think today? How do you think things might develop in the next few years with the introduction of AI, etc.? What impact do you think that might have on persuasion architecture?
I think it's going to have a huge impact. In fact, Dave McInnes, who was the founder of PR Web, who I don't have you interviewed David for?
No, I haven't.
Oh, we need to get you hooked up with David, because PR Web obviously played a huge play in a lot of the early SEO, and he's doing some interesting stuff right now. We've been talking about AI because he just built a new newswire service, but he also built a newswriter.ai, which will use AI to write your own press release. And we're talking about, again, right, he used that to gain Google News early on. Like he understood the value of press releases, right, in terms of SEO. My long-term vision to understand where AI is going to go is each one of us are going to have our own AI butler, so to speak. Okay, you can go back to Ask Jeeves, right? We'll have our own little butlers who will use natural language and different data sources about us. So, for example, there may be a way for our shoes to know that they're getting too worn, okay, in the near future, right? There'll be sensors in there that'll measure the impact of foot pressure, and it will not be expensive to understand, okay, yeah, no, you're getting too much, too close to the ground now. Like all this technology, all this data is out there, that all of a sudden that AI is going to start telling us, hey, we've noticed that your shoes are starting to, to run a little thin. Here are some models based on your size. Are you looking for something? And it will guide the whole sales experience. We will never have to search out websites in the same way. It's going to change the direction of we used to think about push marketing versus pull marketing. This is going to be a whole nother level where it's all of our data sources driving the intelligence and the communication between what messaging we're getting, what ads we're getting, what content we're seeing. It's all going to be driven by AI. It's just a question of when.
It's interesting if we, as you say, if we all end up with our own personal AI butlers, that's probably going to push us all into even deeper into filter bubbles where we are just fragmented from each other, and perhaps what we're seeing becomes more and more personalized.
Oh, 100%. And that butler has its own essentially firewall. It doesn't have to share your data with anybody. It's an anonymous bot that's basically doing all the searching, all the negotiation for you, right, on your behalf.
But in essence, it's quite interesting because it's almost as if we're starting to go backwards, whereas, when the internet happened, we became expanded and opened up to the whole world, whereas now we're going to start to close back down again into these small, fragmented...
It's a pendulum. Society always works in pendulums. My mentor, Roy Williams, actually wrote a book called The Pendulum, and he talked about how society works in 20-year up and 20-year down cycles, okay? Mm-hmm. And he traced this back to millennia. Like, we've always done these generations, right? These 40-year generations, but it's 20-year up, 20-year down. We went, hey, everything should be open source and completely available to, and let's track everything, to where we're going to be like, no, let's bring this all the way back to this data is mine and mine alone. You can't have access to it. I'm only going to let you have it as it's related to it. And that's where I believe, and I'm sure someone's going to hear this and be like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I should build that. Our own personal agents, right? Our own personal search, our own, it's just going to do this all for us, and it'll house all that data and not have to share it publicly.
So if we have a lot of personal butlers and AI chatbots writing, and they're just rehashing and rewriting content, what impact is that going to have on persuasion architecture moving forward?
Well, you still need to provide signals for the bots to discover, right? And so it's still going to be the same thing. Look, at the end of the day, you have to impact humans, right? But you have to understand how the technology will impact humans. You can't dismiss one for the other. And I think it's critical for us to start thinking about, okay, in a world where I need to optimize for the human experience and for what they're going to get, what signals can I create? And this comes back to the early things we talked about with Eric Schmidt and Google, right? How do we replicate the real world? I've said for years, I'm just waiting for Amazon to release their own map product. Why? Because the same way they have their vendor central on there where you can order everything online, why don't they have all the local businesses have their listings on Amazon? And so now when I'm driving around Austin and I want to find a pair of running shoes, okay, I can basically tell my map, hey, I'm looking for a pair of running shoes. I want them to be black and this brand. And it could go ahead and it could search that all the local listings with all the products in the Amazon app, check me out, and I walk in and I walk out and I have the whole experience, or I can have it delivered. That is where things are headed. I think, obviously if COVID didn't hit, I think things were going to be completely different. Acceleration of factors would have shown up. But I think, it's very funny. I had this conversation with the folks at Bing one time. I said, Google would not have been as big as they are if you guys weren't as negligent as you were for local businesses and making it easy for them to list all their products.
Sorry, let's just go into that a little bit deeper. So You think that Google's
Everybody
focus on
focused in
local?
on the people who had technological advantages in the early days of the internet. So the reason Amazon was able to win is because they understood where the internet was going before your local Circuit City understood where it was going, or your local Barnes and Nobles, or your local independent bookstore. But if my independent bookstore understood how to get all their books found and located, and then anything that they didn't have be able to be ordered and do all of that, if Microsoft would have given small businesses all those tools, commerce still would have been a lot more local than internet driven. Right? They gave way to technological superiority versus, hey, I already know the customers. And I think we'll see a swing back a little bit towards that, because I think people want to be recognized and not just be anonymous customers. And I think this is why, Be Like Amazon was such a successful book as well, because we started explaining how they were thinking of the world. And Jeff Bezos has been thinking of this in a way that nobody else has. And if the early search engines were focused in on trying to solve the things the way the real world is early, we may have never have seen Google. We may have never have seen the rise of Amazon either. Like, Microsoft could have controlled all of this early on, and maybe the AI revolution will bring some of this back.
Who do you think is going to win?
I don't know if it's a question of a win, right? There'll always be several players. We've seen that in every industry, right? The Coke and Pepsi, and then there's a whole bunch of third parties. You don't necessarily have one winner. I think we will see. It may even be somebody completely different. But I think what I've been seeing from Microsoft in the last few months definitely shows they are on the right path. They have a lot to overcome, but they are on the right path.
I mean, Google has dominated the industry. It's been a monopoly for 20 years.
Which is about which is what a generation generally is, right? And they're still they're not going to go out of business overnight, right? That doesn't happen to most businesses that have tons of cash. Who would have known Apple would have been so big, right? When we were young and growing up, they were nobody compared to the IBMs and the Sonys even, right? And now Apple dominates because they invented the phone. So this simple device, if I put this into a shopkeeper's device and make it really easy for them to understand everything that's in their shop and everything that's going on, and tracking transactions and inventory, if they put all of this, what is basic technology, in a seamless way, why couldn't any company who did that today start dominating in any industry? They just haven't reduced the friction enough.
Just going back to, was it 99 when Google began to rise? Why do you think that Google started to really take over and dominate the search industry? What would you attribute that to?
So number one, obviously their search results were way better than the Alta Vista and Excites and stuff like that. I mean, it wasn't even comparable. So from a search experience, there's enough people now that cared about search and were using search on a regular basis that it mattered. But the other thing is, very early on, they were very friendly with SEOs, right? Remember the Google dance and all of that. They really participated in the industry until I started noticing they started to play around with manipulating industry, the whole do follow stuff. I was like, yeah, you're just trying to get everybody to call themselves out. That was it. Because for the average webmaster or business owner, they're not going to be thinking about all these. It's too complicated. Like, again, they've added friction to experience that didn't need it. It was only for their benefit. Well, what's their benefit? And so you always have to be skeptical of that. This equation is very, very simple, right? If you always look at the world through this lens, how is the entity reducing friction or increasing the motivation, reasons why I'm doing things? Page sculpting made no sense on either one of those two.
I always feel that Google are very smart in how they developed their relationship with SEOs. I think they use that to obviously help them learn to improve their product, and also for the uptake. You know, they recognize that SEOs were almost the gatekeepers, and yeah, they get them on side.
It was influencer marketing from very early days. They really understood it very well.
And then once the tipping point happened and they had the power, that's when they started to dominate and dictate and say, actually, right now we're in control and we're going to tell you how it's going to be.
Exactly.
Yeah. So just looking back, what are the most important things that you've learned doing persuasion architecture and online marketing?
Wow. It's all about me. It's all about the customer. It's always about the customer. You know, I remember when my mentor, you know, built his reputation in the, you know, the radio advertising business, and he would talk about the importance of the customer, and people would look at him like he's crazy, right? You know, how you have to stand out, how you have to have an impact. You know, there were studies even back then about how, you know, you either had to capture a person's attention the first 8 seconds or they weren't listening. Well, guess what? It was the same thing with people on the web. Human behavior is human behavior. It evolves, it adapts, right? Obviously, you know, having a supercomputer in our pocket has changed us significantly. The number one thing people always have to go back to is understanding how people do and why people do the things they do, and not just your core group, but the kids, because they're going to dictate how things are gonna be in the next few years. They're coming up with new innovations, new ways to look at the world, and slowly we'll adopt those views. That's been a constant, again, for generations, right? These alpha voices of kids will drive the core population. And so I spend a lot of time, you know, looking at what young kids are doing, you know, what apps they're using, what's exciting to them, you know, how they're experiencing certain things, because I want to know where the world is going, not where it is today, right? Because our number one jobs as marketers is to keep ahead of, not of our competition, but of our customers.
Do you think that's what you were really focused on the early days? Really looking at where things go. I mean, obviously we were all a lot younger then, so we were the alpha voices. But did you think you had that in mind at that time, or do you think it's just because you were a lot younger?
No, I think, again, right, I remember having conversations early on. We were talking about, look, you know, if catalog shopping is 10% of all retail, right, the internet is easier than catalogs. You know, it was more cost effective than catalogs. It could reach more people, right? You didn't have to print this thing. I'm like, okay, you know, online shopping's got to be bigger than this, or it's going to be maybe 10, 15%. It's not going to be everything. But we realized it was going to be a significant portion. So I think we always looked ahead to see how people would start buying, but we needed to understand what they were doing now with available technology. And I think that was one of the critical things that we were fortunate with was, you know, I had built my first shopping cart. I had built my first affiliate sales site with you know, with one of my first sites. So when we would go in and work with clients, you know, their teams couldn't tell us it couldn't be done, because we were showing them, well, it can be done. We can do these things. And you know, some of the early things we did were like, you know, really basic things. I mean, literally back in the early days, it was just add a continue shopping button. People would order more than one thing, right? You know, make the checkout button prominent because people couldn't see it, right? Add a phone number to the website, because when they had a hard time, they wanted to finish their order, at least they call you. Those are obvious things. You know, then it became, you know, you got past the basic usability stuff, and then you started have to going more into the persuasion area. And that's when we knew conversion was a dead end. We can only fix so much. Now we need to plan for larger persuasion.
How much do you miss being right at the cutting edge? I mean, back then you were so at the cutting edge. You were obviously building the road in front of you as you were moving. How much do you miss that?
I don't necessarily miss it. I don't have the same energy as I did back then, and I acknowledge that. Doing that and going through our agency until what was it, about 2009, 2010, I think, when we left the agency finally, because it's just about when my last son was born. And I had ballooned up to 277 pounds. I had a terrible lifestyle, sluggish, always felt tired. And, we still ran around the whole world. And after that, I focused in that next 16 months and I lost over 100 pounds. Right. So 40 kilos. And I loved it because I got to spend so much more of that time with my family and my kids, and we didn't have the big agency, we didn't have all these people we needed to account to. So that was wonderful. Now I get to mentor a lot of entrepreneurs who are trying to do that, not necessarily in the online industry, but in other industries. I'm working, for example, with a physical therapist who's developed a whole new method of training the movement system for young athletes. And just mentoring him because I know he's going to do this, and he's got 3 young kids, and I see where he's going to go in the next 10 years. It's like, I've done this path. He's going to follow it because the same principles apply, right? It's just, the tactics have changed. That's it.
So your latest book, Rice and Beans Millionaire, when did that come out?
Funny story on that one. That came out in December. We were hoping to release it earlier. Unfortunately, and one of the reasons Jeffrey's not here is Jeffrey was diagnosed with cancer earlier in the year. He is all clear. But throughout that process and through his treatment, it was hard to get a lot of his energy to help finish the book. So, I'd hoped that we would have it ready by October. We had to push it back. I started setting it up on Amazon. And then when you're doing Kindle print on demand, they only let you change the date by 30 days. So instead of releasing in November, I had to release it in December. And we're like, okay, it is what it is. There wasn't a completely different audience than anything we've ever written before, right? This was really about, young entrepreneurs and business people who want to understand what are all the first principles of business that are required for a successful entrepreneur, no matter what kind of business you're doing, whether you're picking up junk from people's homes, or you're building in Roblox and you're selling there. It's all a lot of the same core principles. And so we finished writing that. It came out in the middle of December, and we've just been slowly sharing it out there, and been getting great feedback about it. Some of the best feedback we've gotten from some of the very successful entrepreneurs that we've consulted with over the years, people who've had very big 6-figure plus exits, or what am I talking about? 8-figure exits, has said, how they can't wait to give this to their kids, right? And this is it. This is the roadmap for that next generation, right? Everybody wants to be an influencer, but what does that actually mean, right? I think become the most sought after job, but I don't think they ever truly understand what influence meant. And we had a lot of influence in this industry early on, but how can you leverage that to create a business? And I think that's critical for not only my kids, but for this whole next generation to understand. And there wasn't a book that covered this topic.
So what's next for Bryan? Are you going to continue writing? Have you got more books in you?
I don't know. As I said, I did come out with this kid's book. Jeffrey and I are working on another SaaS business for business owners of home service businesses. I am also helping my wife start a new business coming up in the next few months. And then I have 2 of my kids who are leaving the home. So my daughter will be entering the industry officially. She's been working, obviously, while she's been in college. She's worked for companies like Indeed and Seesaw and other ed tech companies. But she's moving to Seattle So backyard of Microsoft and Bing there, to work as a consultant in change management around digital tools. So she's not falling so far from the tree. In fact, when we were there looking for apartments for her, we ended up spending some time with Jillian Music.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Having dinner with her while we were up there, her and her husband. My middle son is going off to college to play baseball and continue his education. So he'll be off, come the fall. And then I just have one younger one who's just about to start high school. So got to focus in on him next, and hopefully put him on the right path for him to follow his dreams.
So one last question for you, Bryan, and then we'll start to wrap up. Just looking back, what has been 25 years of working online. If there was anything you could change, is there anything you would have done differently?
The one thing I tell a lot of the entrepreneurs I mentor that I absolutely would have done differently is I would have celebrated the small wins a lot earlier. We got so focused in on the end goal that, and because life happens and bad things happen at the same time, you don't take the time to enjoy those moments. And I'll give you a great example. One of our very, very first training clients, this is probably 99, 2000. And we're flying out to the client, and we're in JFK Airport, and there's a Brookstone in there, and they have one of those big massage chairs in the lounge, right, in their shop. And both Jeffrey and I get in that chair before we get on the flight, and we're just enjoying it. It's like, someday we're going to have one of these. And we never bought it. Never, ever bought it. Even though that was part of our dream. That was part of the way we knew that, hey, we had made success when we bought a few $1,000 chair. Like, it wasn't a big deal. Come COVID, one of the first things I did is I bought that massage chair. Okay. And it was to symbolize that fact that, yeah, you know what, we've made it. I can focus in. I'm in a good spot that I can focus in on what matters to me, which is my family, right? And we've built enough over the years that we can celebrate this moment. And of course, now they all benefit from the massage chair. Nobody was going for massages back then, so it was a great investment. But find the little things to celebrate, because we go through life so fast that we don't take the time to smell the roses, right? To enjoy it. You have a video that reached a certain mark, celebrate it, like enjoy it, because the next goal is going to come up real fast behind you. Okay. And I think that's probably the one of the most important lessons I've learned, besides, obviously having a spouse who supports you in all your crazy adventures, and how critical that is. But celebrate is key.
I would actually recommend, I've just finished reading a book called 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Berkman, which has just completely blown the doors off. And it's a very similar theme about, and I would highly recommend reading it. But it's a very deeply philosophical and poignant place to end. But yeah, I'll say that's probably a really good point for us to wrap up. And I thank you for your time, Bryan. I have been very much looking forward to speaking to you. As I say, your books had a great impact into me moving into online marketing. And so it's really great that all this time later I get to speak to you in person. So thank you for being a pioneer.
This to us is probably one of the things that Jeffrey and I have valued more than anything. How many years later, we hear people say, I saw you speak, I read one of your books, I quit my job and created a big business. I can't tell you how many times we've heard that, and just how satisfying it is to know that we've had an impact on thousands of people's lives over the years. That's what we set out to do, and we accomplished it. And I'll leave you with the tip of my mentor's wife, Penny Williams. And she said, in life, you get to focus on one of three things. You can make a name, right? You can make a difference, or you can make money. All of them can come, but you need to focus on one to be successful, because you can't focus on three things at once, just too hard, right? And we were very glad that we got to focus in on making a difference, because that helped us create a name for ourselves, as well as, you know, having a great entrepreneurial career over the last 25 years.
Well, great words to end on, Bryan, and I will say thank you. You've had a great impact. I've quoted your books many, many times, and so thank you very much for your time. It's been great to speak to you.
Thank you so much, Shelley. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.